they're talking about deploying tactical nukes to East Asia, it's also because they realize the rising Chinese military power means it will be increasingly difficult for U.S. to defeat China in its front yard in a conventional war. That's why they're like, okay, well, nuke is gonna tip the balance for us. Well, I mean, you can't just go a little bit nuke, right? I'm sorry. It's like you can't just be a little bit. It's like my friend joke. You can't just be a little bit gay. You can't be a little. You can't just go a little bit nuclear war. Once you go nuke, it's full out. It's gonna be full out nuclear exchange. Armageddon. Okay, I'm sorry. That's how nuclear deterrence and mutually assured destruction happen. That's the mad theory. But the problem is a lot of the U.S. elite right now, they don't I don't think they believe the mad theory anymore. Somehow they feels like, oh, it's just gonna be U.S. that's gonna do delivering the herd. They don't think the other. This is why you have these talks about giving Ukraine missiles that can strike deep into Russia. They don't think like the Russia and China is not gonna hit back, and they just don't think the U.S. homeland could be hit back. This is very dangerous thinking.
You also brought up something about Mr. Sachs, and since you say that, I'm going to oblige you. I'm going to play a clip from Sachs. Okay.
NATO expressed the neoconservative ideas in its declaration in the 2024 summit in Washington. I find the declaration to be provocative, dangerous for the world, or I should say it's the neoconservative idea that has been dominating U.S. foreign policy for the past 30 years. And NATO is an instrument of U.S. hegemony. So NATO looks at countries that are powerful and that don't want the U.S. to run the world as adversaries or even enemies. And in this regard, Russia and China are viewed as adversaries or enemies because Russia and China are advocating a multipolar world, not a U.S.-led world. NATO should have nothing to do with East Asia. And the fact that NATO is expanding its mission in East Asia is a reflection that the original purpose of NATO, which was a defensive purpose against a potential Soviet invasion of Western Europe, has been subverted by the U.S. neoconservatives to make NATO serve the purpose of U.S. hegemony. I consider it a delusional policy. The U.S. cannot dominate in Asia. China is powerful, China has its security interests, and the U.S. has no business aiming for primacy or hegemony in Asia. The whole idea is very, very dangerous. I do not think that Japan will officially become a member of NATO. Japan is not in the North Atlantic. It's not in Europe. It's not even arguably a member of NATO. But NATO is talking about opening offices or interconnections with the Japanese military, the Korean military, and so forth. If Japan has good sense, if Korea has good sense, and if China's diplomacy is successful, the countries of East Asia will recognize that the United States should not divide them, should not try to make a Cold War in Asia. The United States wants a division. The war is not between Russia and Ukraine. The war is between Russia and the United States. It happens to be taking place on Ukrainian soil. The United States unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002 and began to place missile systems in Poland and Romania, very close to Russia's borders. It's one of the reasons why this war is so dangerous. These are the two biggest nuclear superpowers. They each have 6,000 nuclear warheads, and it's a bit of a puzzle why the Europeans are so silent. As I said, in part because they're part of a US-led political machine They also feel the U.S. is their only nuclear umbrella, so-called. In other words, a nuclear deterrent, because these are not nuclear powers in general. But I think that they miss the main point, which is that a more cooperative, much less aggressive NATO policy would make the European countries far more secure and would make Ukraine secure, because this US-led hegemonic approach, in other words, trying to dominate, is only creating bigger and bigger risks in Europe itself. The problem is that we are talking about two nuclear superpowers, both of which are determined to, quote, win, rather than to settle this war at the negotiating table. And so there's the ever-present risk that this war will escalate into complete nuclear disaster. We have never been closer to nuclear war than we are today. There's a Confucian idea called shu, reciprocity, and that is what we need. The United States should not do unto Russia and China as they would not want Russia and China to do unto them, just as the United States would not like China or Russia to have a military base or missiles in Mexico along the border with the U.S. The U.S. should understand it should not put its missiles and military bases along the border of Russia and China. Confucius would understand this very well. This is just the golden rule. And if we could get behavior that way, the world would be far safer than it is today.
Mr. Sachs, he is talking with a little reasoning after being a part of the so-called Cold War. But Mr. Mearsheimer has a different take on it. Mr. Mearsheimer, he tries to hide imperialistic thought by saying that we should not be fighting in Ukraine. And this is an article that came out. As we were listening to that, I just put in some keywords. Mearsheimer thinks we should focus on China instead of Russia. And an article is titled, "Why One Political Scientist Says the U.S. Should Focus on China Instead of Russia's War in Ukraine." And I'll just read the first part of that. And he says, John Mearsheimer, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, believes the priority of the U.S. in Ukraine should be de-escalation. And people say, whoa, yeah. But it's a reason for that, he says, and that it should shift its focus to China, which he calls the bigger threat. Now, I've listened to a lot of Mearsheimer's talks, and he talks as if China is trying to be this hegemonic power, and that China is trying to dominate. And he never condemns America for what we know being a hegemonic power and trying to dominate and dominating for decades. But because it's China, even though he has nothing to substantiate that part that China is trying to dominate or usurp America's authority, because China is a big power and not beholden to the West, he wants confrontation with China or containment of China. These are two of the things that either to contain China or be forced to confront China. That's confrontation or containment. Why is it that political scientists like that has the ear of everybody and that has influence, are not challenged on those positions and say, hey, let's just say for a minute China wants to be the hegemonic power, and you say there's something wrong with that. Well, why isn't there something wrong with the United States being a hegemonic power? Why isn't it wrong with the United States being the dominant power in Asia? And she does not even reside in Asia. Why is that so hard to comprehend, Carl? And why won't anybody question that?
Well, I think John Mearsheimer is someone who understands U.S. and the U.S. empire very well as an insider. But That's why he assumed everyone else think just like United States. There's a lot of projection when he comes to talk about China, how China is just going to act exactly like United States. The underlying assumption is that U.S. empire is normal. This is the norm. This is what everybody would do if they're in our position. No, that's not the case. U.S. is quite unprecedented in the world history as a kind of the global hegemon and building a global empire. And there's no other country that has kind of has its national foundation built on genocide and slavery, like the way United States was. It's ridiculous to project the unique circumstances of U.S. mentality, which has always been very cutthroat and zero sum, on a nation like China, which existed for thousands of years. It's so. So when Mearsheimer talks about United States, I listen. When he talks about U.S. empire, I listen. When he starts talking about what China would do, I just like I just turn it off because I don't need to go to Mearsheimer to understand China. And the problem is with this kind of thinking is it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think China is an enemy and you treat China as an enemy, China will start seeing you as a potential threat. I mean, this is common sense. When you ring China with missiles and your vassal states and U.S. military bases, China is going to build up its own military response, like what happened in the last 20 years. It's a reciprocality, like a lot of the American elite, they don't understand it's a two-way street. They think, okay, it's just U.S. that's going to hit other people, Russia, China, or Iran. They don't think, yeah, they could actually hit you back. Last time this happened, when U.S. put nuclear tipped missiles in Turkey against Soviet Union, Khrushchev put missiles on Cuba. This happened during the JFK era, and at that time, U.S. almost blew up the world. U.S. threatened a nuclear war to get the Soviets to back down, to take the missiles out of Cuba. Yeah, right now, U.S. is putting missiles in the Philippines. They're selling missiles to Taiwan. They're placing that system in South Korea, all around the periphery of China. And this is underlying assumption is that if we're going to go to war with China, the war is going to happen in China's front yard. It's going to, it's going to be the bombs and missiles going to hit Chinese coast. The assumption is that China will not hit back. This is launched that ICBM test recently towards South Pacific, United States. We have some delivery capability, we're also a nuclear power and we have means to deliver it. And this is another reason for U.S. to deploy tactical. They're talking about deploying tactical nukes to East Asia. It's also because they realize the rising Chinese military power means it will be increasingly difficult for U.S. to defeat China in its front yard in a conventional war. That's why they're like, okay, well, nuke is going to tip the balance for us. Well, I mean, you can't just go a little bit nuke. Right? I'm sorry. It's like you can't just be a little bit. It's like my friend joke. You can't just be a little bit gay. You can't be. You can't just go a little bit nuclear war. Once you go nuke, it's full out. It's gonna be full out nuclear exchange. Armageddon. Okay, I'm sorry. That's how nuclear deterrence and mutually assured destruction happen. That's the mad theory. But the problem is a lot of the U.S. elite right now, I don't think they believe the mad theory anymore. Somehow they feels like, oh, it's just gonna be U.S. that's gonna do delivering the herd. They don't think the other. This is why you have these talks about giving Ukraine missiles that can strike deep into Russia. They don't think like the Russia and China is not gonna hit back, and and they just don't think the U.S. homeland could be hit back. This is very dangerous thinking. But we'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens with the Trump in office in a couple of months, because I predict there's going to be a lot of pandemonium. There's a lot of chaos, a lot of panic before the dust settle, and then we can gain a true clear picture of how Trump foreign policy is going to shape out. So I'm going to. I'm happy that Kamala campaign got defeated, because if that had happened, it's just going to be the same old, and we know how that turned out. It's going to be increasing confrontation in all three fronts of the war. Whether the pit, another deceit, another conceit of U.S. elite when they talk about how U.S. is going to handle Russia and China is because they think by just offering olive branch to Russia right now at this point, and suddenly they will be able to turn Russia against China. Like they think they can do like a reverse Kissinger, like how Nixon, during Nixon visit China and pull China into the anti-Soviet camp. But the thinking, the problem again is like it's a narcissistic thinking. Nixon did not turn China against Soviet Union. Sino-Soviet split actually happened, created the condition for Nixon to visit China, not the vice versa. Kissinger didn't manage to turn China against Soviet Union. So China and Soviet Union were already fighting border wars before Nixon ever visited. So right now, that condition do not exist. They can't just somehow like magically switch Russia against China, because Russian leaders are not stupid. Like unlike Washington elite, unlike American leaders, Putin is not stupid. And after what they have just done to Russia, they're not going to suddenly say, "Oh, okay, well, let's all be friends. Let's all go fight China." I mean, this is wishful thinking. This is wishful thinking, and that derived from kind of the very the narcissistic U.S. hegemonic mindset. They think they can control the world event just like that, snap of their finger. That's not going to happen.
As you were talking, especially when you were talking about you can't be just a little gay, you're going to be all the way gay, and it can't be a little miniature. Nuclear war is going to be all the way. And that reminded me of during the term of Xi Jinping when he was the president of China, and they were asking him about all of the threats that the United States were throwing at China back then about defending Taiwan and all of this, and he was so calm and so humble, and he said, "I don't think that they would be prepared to trade California for Taiwan," meaning that if it was going to be a nuclear war, then it would not just be in Asia against China. It would reach the U.S.'s border. I remember that vividly, and it stunned the reporter that was asking the questions and stuff. And now we see that China is leaps and bounds ahead of where they were under Xi Jinping. I want to play something for you. It's a bit long, I would say, for a clip, but I want to play this, and this has something. It came out about a year ago, but it's pertinent to right now. And this guy is being asked questions on global. I think this is Global Times, and he is answering them in like two different segments. And I just want you to listen to this, and on the backside of this, come back and tell me your thoughts on this. All right.
But does that mean that people in the U.S. actually are willing to go to war with China? That's a whole different question. But I also think that if the war were to actually come to fruition, that a lot of people would say, regardless of what we think about China, we're not willing to send our children, our brothers and sisters, to go fight a war against China, to go risk their lives, to be killed. The U.S. is a hypocritical society, if that was the one word, hypocrisy. That it's a government it's a society that's presented itself as the exceptional nation, the nation above all other nations. And yet, internally, inside the U.S., everything they accuse everyone else of, they practice at home. And sometimes to even greater degree. You know, there's 856 people were killed by the police in the United States last year. 856, at least that was in mid-December when I looked at the numbers. It's probably higher by the year's end. And yet, you know, the US lectures the world about state violence and human rights. It's as if the US is not a human rights violator. So, and that's just one example. You could take almost any category, and when you start to scrutinize it, you find hypocrisy. The US obscures its own history of modernization, in fact. People just think the US arrived as a modern society or something. You know, the US is founded by slaveholders, drug dealers. You know, they were selling tobacco and sugar. People were stealing the land. And the fact that they had this huge territory where they basically expelled everyone, committed genocide, had this property for free that had all this land, it allowed the US, it had certain advantages in terms of its modernization process. But even still, when it industrialized, it used massive amounts of child labor, massive amounts of immigrant labor, people who were worked to death. Every major infrastructure project in the 1800s and early 1900s in the United States, the bridges, the canals, the tunnels, they had huge amounts of suffering attached to them. This was the human cost of so-called modernization. And there was such enormous inequality that was generated at that time from inside the US, and then also basically colonialism, neo-colonialism, slavery. These are the sort of the preconditions for US modernization. But, you know, the fact that China has basically done it in a few short decades compared to the length of time that the West modernized, and done it with, I would say, far less human suffering, and without basically extracting lots of value from the rest of the world, without colonialism, is an amazing achievement. And frankly, I think the one thing that gets underestimated about Chinese modernization is the role of the Communist Party of China. You know, the fact that you actually have a government that can set 5, 10, 15-year plans, can set goals that are 30, 50 years out, and then assess the political leadership at every level based on whether it's achieving those goals is very different from the US political system, where a politician comes in, they have no interest in an infrastructure project that's going to be finished in 20 years or 10 years. They have no interest in a poverty alleviation program that's not going to deliver immediate results. Why? Because their election is coming up in 2 years or 4 years. It's so competitive, so individualistic, focused really around short-term thinking. That's the reason why all the bridges are collapsing in the United States, why there's so many train derailments. I think that with the magnitude of the challenges, whether it's climate change, technology, you know, unemployment, all these different things, this is the moment in history where long-term planning is going to be heavily rewarded. I don't think a war between the US and China is totally inevitable. I think it is avoidable, but it's not avoidable unless there's a change in the form of government, basically, in the United States. I think both parties have a consensus right now that while they can disagree on almost any other issue, that if China is allowed to grow peacefully for the foreseeable future, that means the US will lose its place as the top dog in the whole world. And both parties are united that this is completely an unacceptable outcome. It's true that people in the US now have a more negative view of China than they did a few years ago because of the nonstop propaganda. People's perceptions of China can change a lot based on this propaganda. But does that mean that people in the US actually are willing to go to war with China? That's a whole different question. But I also think that if the war were to actually come to fruition, that a lot of people would say, regardless of what we think about China, we're not willing to send our children, our brothers and sisters, to go fight a war against China, to go risk their lives, to be killed. I think at that point, there would basically be a pre-revolutionary situation in the United States. And so that's why I think the US knows this, and they're trying to, instead of have actual war with China, what they're trying to do is increase the pressure on China, to encircle China, to use information war, hybrid war, financial war, to try to stimulate more contradictions inside of China. Once you start to let people know, well, actually the people in China, for whatever criticisms and problems they have and whatever debates there are, and of course there's lots of debates here, they support the government, they have trust in a lot of their institutions, higher levels of trust than we have in the West. That whole narrative of basically the US as the white knight, the humanitarian savior, it starts to fall apart. But I think as China emerges more and more in the world, it will become a reference point for many other countries that have a similar history of colonialism, especially how to overcome colonialism. So my hope is that China, again, can become a reference point for an alternative model. In Latin America and Africa, people are tired of a financial system where they become deeply indebted, where they are basically made to produce only one crop or one natural resource. They have no strategic leverage or advantage in the global trading system. And China represents an alternative. China represents usually better terms when it comes to loans, better trade agreements, less strings attached, more political autonomy where China doesn't try to, pick and choose who's going to lead the different governments of the global south. So if you're a government in Africa or Latin America, that's going to become very attractive after you've been dealing with the IMF for decades. It's not like any one country is perfect. But the whole narrative of neo-colonialism, that is an invention that is being designed to preserve Western hegemony in Africa. They see the writing on the wall. They see what is the global population going to look like in 50 years? It's going to be overwhelmingly Asian and African. And so how does the West maintain its domination if that's the case? The only way it can maintain its domination is if it gets the vast majority of people in Africa to distrust the people in Asia, and vice versa. So they have an interest in building now a narrative that splits up any kind of unity, strategic unity between Asia and Africa. I think this is to them the greatest threat they're facing.
So, Carl, what do you have to say over this? Before you answer, I want the people to understand that there's almost 1.5 billion people in China. There's almost 1.5 billion people in India. There's 1.5 billion people on the continent of Africa. There's hundreds of millions of the Pan-African diaspora all across the Western Hemisphere. And the guy says that they don't want the dynamics to change, even though it's going to be overwhelmingly African and Asian in the future. What do you have to say about the policies? Because to me, Carl, if I know that I've done something wrong, and I know that I continue to do something wrong, and I see that if I continue to do this later on down the line, it will not benefit me. It will be to a detriment. The first thing I would do is say, hey, let me talk to the Chinese. Let me talk to the Africans. Let me talk to the people that I antagonized, that I exploited, that I did something to, and not just talk to them, but show true contrition of heart and try to make amends, because there's going to come a time when it's flipped and I won't have the power to say. So maybe if I show that I'm sorry, when the power dynamics change, they won't be looking for revenge, and maybe my fall won't be as hard and as far. What do you have to say about that?
See, Rasheed, that's why you are not the president of the United States. It takes a special breed of people who rise to the top in the U.S. political system. It takes a special breed of people who are so self-interested, so self-centered, and short-term thinking, and it's only those people get to bubble up to the top of the system, and this is why U.S. is in the situation it is in right now. But about the video, I agree with almost everything he said, except John Mearsheimer actually had an opposite opinion. He thinks if the war does break out between U.S. and China, he thinks because the U.S. state propaganda is so powerful, you will be able to convince its public to go along with U.S. U.S. plan for war, even if it goes against the interest of the public. Which I have some kind of sympathy for John Mearsheimer's point of view, because that's what we have observed in the past. That's what happened with the Iraq War, etc. But the difference is scale, right? Iraq War, U.S. did that with a volunteer force. There was no draft. There was no draft. One of the biggest opposition to Vietnam War is a draft. People did not want to be drafted to go die in the Southeast Asian jungles. And there's no way U.S. can fight what they think a limited war with China with the current force level they have. Like John Mearsheimer believed they could. John Mearsheimer believes that with U.S. current military posture in East Asia, with the involvement of the allies, Japan, Korea, Australia, Philippines, etc., they're able to, start the conflict and hold the line until United States can fully mobilize and fully propagandize its public to go to war. I don't think it will come to that. John Mearsheimer also said, he thinks the actual possibility of war is quite small in Taiwan Strait. So I agree with what the presenter in the video said. What the U.S. will do is they wage the hybrid war, which is informational war. All these negative propaganda against China is part of it. It's to convince the public that what U.S. Don't question the U.S. policy toward China. This is why we cannot make up with China, because China is evil and we are righteous. And the economic war. We have the chip sanction against China. We have all kind of and we're going to place high tariffs on Chinese product. This is right now. U.S. is not at a full kinetic hot war with China. U.S. is already waging an economic war against China. That has happened since 2018, since the first term Trump presidency. It will likely continue into the second term Trump presidency, because U.S. believe it could weaken China through this combination of hybrid war, of informational warfare and economic warfare. But I don't think it's going to work. I think it's already backfiring right now by cutting off revenue from the U.S. and Western countries in line with the U.S. sanctions on China. Intel just laid off a lot of its workers because Intel right now, they can't sell to China, one of its largest markets. Intel is the first. It's going to also happen to ASML, the Dutch company that makes the USB machines, that makes the most advanced chip, not allowed to sell to China. It's going to happen across a huge section of the U.S. tech industry when they're cut off from one of the world's largest markets. And once they lose that market, once China are able to indigenize the production of the semiconductors, those markets are not coming back, because the Chinese companies are no longer going to source their supply chain out overseas when they know that supply chain is unreliable and is liable to be cut off by U.S. policy anytime. They would rather go buy domestic if they have the chance. So that means once these Western companies that participate in U.S. sanctions lose the Chinese market, they're going to lose the Chinese market forever.
Yep.
And the fact that people don't realize, yes, the war is going to be Asian and African. Chinese trade with United States is only 3% of the GDP. People in U.S. think, oh, U.S. is so indispensable nation. If we just cut off trade with China, Chinese economy is going to collapse. No. You cut off China, that means you're not going to get goods in your supermarket. China will be fine. Or maybe they will shave off 3% of their GDP, but that's not the end of the world. But you're not going to get toilet paper, from Walmart. And so it's crazy talk. It's crazy talk. I don't think I don't think that China's rise will be stopped at this point by these simple economic sanctions. So China's rise has already been baked in. Like the Western Jim Rogers a long time ago, he said I think Jim Rogers said this in 2000. He said the secular rise of China is baked in. Nothing could stop it without like a nuclear Armageddon. Right? So I don't think nuclear Armageddon we're all screwed, but I don't think it's going to come to that. So I think China will continue to rise despite all the obstructions putting in by U.S. Will only end up boomerang to hurt U.S. and the Western economy even more. So yeah, that's